The sun beamed down warmly that morning, casting a golden glow over the grand wedding venue. White roses lined the aisle, delicate petals scattered over the crimson carpet. Guests sat in neatly arranged rows, dressed in their finest, whispering with excitement about the beautiful bride-to-be, Kiara. She stood in her dressing room, gazing at her reflection in the mirror. Her ivory gown shimmered under the light, hugging her slender figure while the lace sleeves added an air of elegance. Her hair was perfectly styled in soft curls, her veil gently resting on her shoulders. Kiara's eyes sparkled, not just from the expensive makeup, but from the happiness bubbling inside her. Today wasn't just any day. It was the day she would marry the man she believed was her forever. "Kiara, it's time," her best friend whispered from the doorway. Taking a deep breath, Kiara clutched her bouquet of fresh lilies and roses, the same flowers her fiancé had once given her when he first confessed his love. Each step towards the aisle felt like a dream. The music swelled, a soft melody of violins filling the hall. Everyone turned to look at her. Cameras flashed. Some guests teared up at how breathtaking she looked. At the altar stood her groom, tall, handsome, and dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. Kiara's heart raced with excitement. She imagined his smile widening as she approached, but instead she noticed something strange. His expression wasn't filled with joy. There was no sparkle in his eyes. Instead, there was tension, almost coldness. She brushed it off, telling herself it was just nerves. Weddings were overwhelming after all. Finally, she reached him. He didn't even offer his hand to help her step up. The priest began the ceremony, speaking warmly about the sacred bond of marriage, about love and trust. Kiara's gaze stayed locked on her groom's face, searching for the warmth she'd always known. But as the priest asked the question, "Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" something unimaginable happened. The groom stepped back. A wave of murmurs spread through the crowd. Kiara's smile faltered. She thought maybe he needed a moment, but instead he turned to the priest and shook his head. Then he looked at her, eyes cold, voice sharp, and said the words that sliced through her heart like a blade. "I can't do this!" Gasps echoed through the room. Someone dropped their champagne glass, the shatter ringing in the stunned silence. Kiara froze, her hands trembling as she clutched her bouquet tighter. She wanted to speak, to ask why, but her voice wouldn't come out. The groom took a step back, then another, until he turned his back entirely. In full view of the guests, the photographers, the flowers, and the music still playing, he walked away, out of the venue, out of her life. Her vision blurred as tears welled up. She heard whispers, some pitying, some cruel. Did she do something? Was he forced to marry her? I knew it wouldn't last. The weight of humiliation crushed her chest. She stood there alone, under the arch of roses they had chosen together, the future they had planned turning to ashes in her mind. Kiara wanted to disappear, to escape the hundreds of eyes watching her unravel, but her legs felt like stone. The violin music faltered and stopped. Even the flowers seemed to lose their scent. Her dream wedding, the one she had waited for her entire life, had just turned into the most public and devastating heartbreak imaginable. And this was only the beginning of her nightmare. Morning, Kiara woke up with swollen eyes and a pounding headache. The once pristine wedding dress now lay crumpled in the corner of her room, stained with tears and smeared makeup. The scent of her bouquet, now wilting in the trash bin, still lingered in the air, haunting her like a cruel reminder. She hadn't slept all night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw it again. His face turning cold, his voice saying, "I can't do this," and the sound of his footsteps walking away. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Missed calls, dozens of unread messages. News had spread quickly. After all, who wouldn't gossip about a groom abandoning his bride at the altar? Social media was already flooded with photos, videos, and cruel captions. Some called her the unlucky bride, Others speculated about her hidden flaws that must have scared him away. She tried not to read them, but one comment cut through like a knife. Maybe he found out she's not as innocent as she looks. Kiara's trembling hands went instinctively to her stomach. She had been planning to tell her husband the news after the wedding, thinking it would be the perfect surprise, a symbol of their growing love. But now, the child inside her was no longer a shared blessing. It was a secret, one she'd be forced to carry alone. She sat on the edge of her bed, whispering to herself as tears streamed down her cheeks. I'm pregnant, and he doesn't even know or care. Her thoughts spun in dizzying circles. What would people say if they found out? In her community, a child born out of wedlock was not just frowned upon, it was a scandal. She would become the subject of relentless judgment, the center of whispers at every gathering. She picked up her phone again, scrolling through the contacts. For a moment, she hovered over her ex-fiancé's number. Should she tell him? Should she give him the chance to take responsibility? But then she remembered the look in his eyes at the altar. That wasn't the gaze of a man who had any intention of coming back. Her family, though loving, had been left humiliated too. Her father hadn't said much since that day, but she saw the deep disappointment etched on his face. Her mother tried to comfort her, but Kiara could see the fear behind her words, the fear of how society would treat their daughter now. By afternoon, Kiara forced herself to get out of bed. She walked to the kitchen, her hands absently resting on her belly. The thought of food made her stomach churn, but she knew she had to take care of herself now, not just for her sake, but for the tiny life inside her. When her best friend Maya arrived unannounced, Kiara collapsed into her arms. Between sobs, she finally said the words aloud. Maya, I'm pregnant. Maya froze, then tightened her hold on her friend. Oh, Kiara, she whispered, voice breaking. We'll figure this out. I'm here for you. But deep down, Kiara wasn't sure if figuring it out was even possible. The walls of her world had already crumbled, and now she stood on the edge of a cliff, unsure if she could face what lay ahead. In that moment, one thing became painfully clear. Her fight was no longer just about mending a broken heart. It was about protecting a life and finding the strength to do it in a world that would be quick to condemn her. Little did she know, fate had already placed someone on her path, someone who would change everything. It was late afternoon, and Kiara found herself wandering aimlessly through the quiet streets near her apartment. The sky was overcast, as if the world itself shared her gloom. She clutched her coat tighter around her, though it wasn't the cold she feared. It was the crushing weight of loneliness pressing down on her. Her thoughts churned like storm clouds. The whispers, the pitying looks, the uncertainty of her future. They all swirled together until her chest ached. She needed air, space, anything to silence the noise in her head. Lost in thought, she didn't notice the uneven pavement until it was too late. Her foot caught, and she stumbled forward, dropping her handbag. The contents spilled, her phone, keys, a crumpled tissue, scattering across the wet ground. Here, let me help you, a deep, steady voice said. She looked up to see a tall man kneeling beside her, gathering her things. His dark hair was slightly tousled, his coat sharp and well-fitted. There was something about his presence, calm, grounded, that made her freeze for a moment. Are you all right? He asked, handing her the keys. Yes, thank you, she murmured, embarrassed. She reached for her phone, but he had already picked it up, carefully wiping the screen before giving it back. You seem distracted, he said gently, almost as if he could see straight into her thoughts. Kiara forced a small smile. It's been a rough few days. He didn't press for details, which she appreciated. Instead, he gestured toward the small cafe across the street. I was just about to get some coffee. Would you join me? You look like you could use something warm. Normally, she would have refused. Talking to strangers wasn't her habit, especially now when she felt so raw. But something in his tone wasn't pushy. It was simply kind. Against her own expectations, she found herself nodding. The cafe was quiet, the air rich with the scent of roasted beans. They sat by the window, steam rising from their mugs. Kiara stared at her latte, unsure what to say, until he spoke again. "My name's Adrian." "Kiara," she replied softly. Adrian smiled. "That's a beautiful name." They talked, at first about small things, the weather, the neighborhood, but somehow the conversation deepened without her realizing. She found herself admitting that she had been through something painful recently, though she didn't share the whole truth. And he listened, really listened. No interruptions, no unsolicited advice, just quiet understanding. When the rain began to fall outside, Kiara glanced at the time. "I should get going," she said reluctantly. Adrian reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple card. "If you ever need someone to talk to about anything, call me. No pressure." She took the card, her fingers brushing his. There was an unspoken sincerity in his eyes, a promise that felt strangely safe. Walking back home, Kiara kept glancing at the card in her hand. She didn't know who Adrian really was, or why he had chosen to help her, but his kindness had lit a small, fragile spark inside her, a spark she thought had died at the altar. For the first time in days, she felt that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't entirely alone. What she didn't realize was that Adrian wasn't just a kind stranger. He was a man whose life, wealth, and influence could alter her future in ways she could never imagine. Days turned into weeks, and Kiara found herself thinking about Adrian more often than she expected. At first, she hesitated to call him. She didn't want to burden a stranger with her problems. But loneliness has a way of breaking down walls, and one rainy evening she finally dialed his number. He answered almost instantly. "Kiara, are you all right?" Something about the way he said her name, concerned, steady, made her throat tighten. "I just needed someone to talk to," she admitted. "Meet me at the park near your street. I'll be there in 10 minutes, he said without hesitation. True to his word, Adrian arrived, holding an umbrella big enough to shield them both from the drizzle. They walked slowly along the winding path, the soft patter of rain around them. At first, Kiara spoke in broken fragments, about the wedding, the humiliation, the loneliness. She didn't mention her pregnancy yet, afraid it would change the way he looked at her. Adrian didn't pity her. He didn't judge. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions, the kind that made her feel seen rather than interrogated. When she faltered, he simply walked beside her in silence, letting her breathe. In the days that followed, Adrian became a constant presence. He would drop by with groceries, insisting she shouldn't overexert herself. Sometimes he'd find her curled up on the couch, staring blankly at the wall, and he'd coax her into joining him for a walk or a quiet meal. One afternoon, they sat in the corner of a small library. Kiara flipped through a novel, though her eyes kept drifting to Adrian as he quietly read beside her. There was something grounding about his presence, as though he carried a stillness that made the chaos in her mind feel less overwhelming. "You know," Adrian said suddenly, closing his book, "pain has a way of convincing us we're broken, but it's not true. You're not broken, Kiara. You're in the middle of your story. You just haven't reached the part where it starts to make sense yet." His words lodged in her heart. For so long, she had felt like a shattered version of herself, but Adrian's voice made her wonder if maybe she still had worth, if maybe her story wasn't over. As the weeks passed, Kiara began to notice small things about him. He always dressed sharply, but never flaunted it. He drove an unassuming car, but one that was clearly well-maintained. He seemed to know every restaurant owner they visited, yet he never acted entitled. There was an understated authority about him, but he wore it lightly. One evening, as they sat on her balcony sipping tea, Kiara finally let a small piece of her truth slip. She rested her hand on her stomach, without thinking, and Adrian's gaze followed the movement. Kiara, he said gently, are you... She froze, then nodded. Yes, I'm pregnant. Adrian's expression didn't shift into judgment or surprise. It softened. Then I'm even more glad I met you, he said quietly, because no one should go through something like this alone. His acceptance made her eyes burn with tears. She had expected distance, maybe even withdrawal. Instead, Adrian seemed more determined to be there. From that night on, he checked in on her daily, making sure she ate well and got enough rest. He even researched prenatal care and shyly handed her a list of doctors with good reputations. Though Kiara still didn't know who Adrian truly was, one thing was certain. His kindness was stitching her heart back together, piece by piece. And yet, behind his warm smile, there was still an air of mystery, one that would eventually reveal a truth she could never have predicted. It had been nearly 2 months since Adrian first stepped into Kiara's life. In that time, the bleak shadows that had once suffocated her had begun to lift. She smiled more often now. She could go out without feeling the sting of humiliation in every glance from strangers. And when loneliness threatened to creep back in, Adrian was always there, steady as the sunrise. But something about him still puzzled her. He never spoke much about himself. Whenever she asked about his work, he would answer vaguely, "I'm in business," and quickly steer the conversation back to her. He always paid for things without hesitation, but his lifestyle didn't quite match the quiet, unassuming man she thought he was. One Friday evening, Adrian called. "I need you to come somewhere with me tomorrow. It's important." The next day, a sleek black car arrived at her building. Adrian stepped out, dressed in a tailored suit that seemed to belong on the cover of a magazine. He opened the door for her without a word, and the car glided through the city streets until it reached a towering glass skyscraper in the heart of downtown. "Where are we?" she asked as they stepped inside. "My office," Adrian replied. The elevator opened into a sprawling penthouse floor, walls of glass overlooking the skyline, modern art adorning the walls, and a team of impeccably dressed assistants who greeted Adrian with deep respect. Kiara's breath caught. This wasn't just an office. This was a corporate empire. As they walked through, employees nodded to him with a mix of awe and familiarity. Finally, Adrian led her into a private meeting room. "I think it's time you knew the truth," he said, his tone calm but serious. "My full name is Adrian Blackwell. I'm the CEO of Blackwell Enterprises." Kiara stared at him, the words struggling to register. She had heard of the company before. Everyone had. It was one of the largest conglomerates in the country, owning everything from luxury hotels to tech firms. "You're a billionaire?" she asked quietly, almost afraid to say the word. "Yes," he admitted, "but that's not why I helped you. I didn't want you to see me as a man defined by money. I wanted you to see me for who I am. Just Adrian." Her heart twisted. For weeks he had been there for her without asking for anything in return. He had listened, cared, and stood by her side, not because of obligation or pity, but because he truly wanted to. "But why me?" she whispered. Adrian's gaze held hers, steady and unwavering. "Because the day I met you, I saw someone who was drowning, and I knew what that felt like. I've had everything money could buy, Kiara, but I also know what it's like to lose the things that really matter. I didn't want you to face that alone." Her eyes burned with tears, but this time they weren't from pain. They were from gratitude. She realized that Adrian's wealth didn't change who he was. It only meant that he had more power to protect and care for the people he valued. In that quiet room high above the city, Kiara felt the pieces of her broken heart falling back into place. Not because Adrian was rich, but because he had proven himself to be the kind of man she thought didn't exist anymore. A man who stood by her when she had nothing to offer in return. And as she looked at him, she knew her story was no longer one of abandonment and shame. It was a story of resilience, of unexpected kindness, and of a love that had found her when she least expected it. This time, she wasn't just standing at the beginning of a new chapter, she was standing beside someone